Welcome to Future of Fandom, the podcast where leagues, teams, and federations learn how to turn passive viewers into loyal superfans through gamification, loyalty, and next-gen engagement. Let's build what's next together.
Hi, I'm Alex Hay, VP of Business Development and Strategy at LiveLike, and welcome back to the Future of Fandom. Sport doesn't have borders anymore, and neither does fandom. The question is whether the media industry has caught up. My guest today is Olek Loewenstein, Global President of Sport at TelevisaUnivision, one of the world's largest Spanish-language media companies and a business that sits right at the center of one of the most important shifts in global fandom. Olek has a term for what he sees happening: the bicultural fan, a generation of US Hispanic audiences who blend Mexican League with MLS, reggaeton with hip-hop, local allegiance with global nomadism, and who are rewriting the rules of what it means to follow sport. We're going to unpack what that actually means for media companies, for rights holders, for anyone trying to build products for a fan who doesn't fit the old boxes. This one is going to make you rethink where the next generation of fans is actually coming from. Let's get into it. Olek, for the benefit of our listeners, could you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your role?
Olek Loewenstein. I am the Global President of Sports for TelevisaUnivision, which basically means I do everything from ordering and serving coffee all the way to buying rights for TelevisaUnivision and the sports side. So fun times.
Very broad and very busy at the moment with the World Cup, I'd imagine.
Yeah, it's a busy time. We obviously have the rights to the World Cup here in Mexico, and the World Cup is in Mexico, which is a double headache. So it's better than other jobs where I would be stuck in an office 24/7 or in a submarine under the Atlantic Ocean. But this is for sure challenging and fun at the same time, I guess.
I love it. And you talk a lot about the bicultural fan bleeding Latin America and Italian, an American pop culture into a single identity. When did you first realize that the industry's existing frameworks simply couldn't describe what you were seeing anymore?
I don't know if there was an aha moment, to be honest. I think everything became obvious when I stopped seeing audiences behaving the way the industry expected them to, right? This traditional model that assumed that people lived inside a neat demographic box like Hispanic or American, soccer or football, Spanish or English, because that's not necessarily how millions of people actually live, right? I would meet fans who watch Liga MX on Saturday and the NFL on Sunday, listen to reggaeton and hip hop, spoke Spanish with their parents and English with their friends. The industry treated those as separate audiences, and the audience experienced them just as one identity, right? So it wasn't that the framework was wrong. I think what happened is the framework was incomplete, right? It was built for a world where culture moved slowly, because today's fans live in the interaction of these multiple cultures and multiple sports at the same time. So I don't know if that answers the question, but maybe the answer is it wasn't a specific point in time. It was a realization over the past few years that the audience had migrated to something that didn't resemble the traditional demographic models.
Absolutely. And how do you and how does, by extension, TelevisaUnivision, do things differently as a result of this realization?
So I think it's part of what I said, right? We start with the audience's identity rather than the categories that the industry encapsulates them within, right? So a traditional media company might ask whether something is Hispanic content or general market content. We ask whether it's culturally relevant to the audience we have. That's what you'll see someone consuming Liga MX, MLS, right? On Apple, right? Really, we have Liga MX, MLS on Apple, entertainment somewhere else, music on our platforms, but at the same time on Spotify, and social content within this ecosystem, both in English and Spanish. We're not trying to force people into a lane, I guess. I mean, what we're trying to do is expand the lane that we have so people can move within. I think the opportunity for us is in serving one audience or one culture. It's serving the overlap that exists within this Hispanic demographic in the US.
Interesting. And what would you say generally is driving that, first of all? And secondly, What does that mean for anyone trying to build a fan or consumer base today?
From a brand standpoint, for example, from an agency standpoint, from a enterprise standpoint, I think the structures that were there before, where you had identified a head of Hispanic for an agency or a head of Hispanic for a brand, I think that gets murky, right? Because if you're the head of Hispanic and you're choosing Mr. Beast as an influencer, right? Mr. Beast is the biggest influencer on YouTube, full stop. He reaches Hispanic and cuts across all types of demographics. So you can't encapsulate the idea of that Hispanics only consume Hispanic influencers. You can't encapsulate the idea that Hispanics only consume music in Spanish. So I think if it had happened overnight, then I think all these organizations would have changed the structure and how they operate. Given that it has changed over time, is a little bit of the story of the frog in the hot pot that it boils over time. I think people have to look back and ask themselves the question: am I structured in another way? Am I operating in the right way to actually reach the demographics and the audience as it's composed today? Right. And I think in many cases the answer will be probably not. Probably you have a very traditional way of reaching people, and to the extent that you continue thinking single channel, single demographic profile, single genre, then it's going to be very difficult to be very effective, right? I mean, you're probably going to have to spend more money that you should reaching that audience, because you're going to have to allocate money in those ways.
For sure. And when we think about sports specifically, I think players and athletes in their own right have become media companies. How does that change the relationship between a platform like yours and the athletes themselves?
So you're absolutely right. I mean, I've said this multiple times, I think, over the past year. When leagues started, fans had a relationship with the league, right? That's historically that was the case. Then fans had a relationship with the team, because the teams was where the primary storytelling vehicle happened, right? Where the primary storytelling happened. That's not the case as much today. Today, a teenager can follow a player directly every day through their social platforms. So the athlete is no longer mediated by the club or the league. He becomes a media platform on its own. So again, what that means is not that the teams and the leagues disappear. It means that the loyalty is becoming more layered, in terms of, like, you might be a fan of Mbappe and at the same time a fan of PSG, and one thing is not conflicting with another, right? I mean, you might be happy that Mbappe left PSG because they're playing now and they're winning the Champions League, yet you won't become a fan of Madrid just because Mbappe is there, right? You might prefer to watch the Premier League, even though that your team is PSG because you grew up in France, and that your favorite player is Mbappe, even though he plays in Spain. So I think the layering is what forces us to be able to adjust the storytelling. In the past, we would have, before a World Cup, just to give an example, we would have gone and interviewed all these players, right? Done a profile of Mbappe, a profile of Haaland. Today, that's useless, because by the time you were done with the profile and you put it on a linear platform, your audience has already had more access to that player than whatever you can give them in 30 minutes. So if we have the time with Haaland, then it's taking him out of his comfort zone, right? Let's have Haaland cook, right? Let's have Haaland play tennis. And then you show a different thing that he's probably not showing through his platforms as media. On the other hand, if that's not what we have, then let's not talk about Haaland. Let's talk about the things that we can have access to. Let's talk about the teams. Let's talk about the competition, the culture, because otherwise you will never be able to tell the story as well as the source itself, right? So that's how we have changed that relationship, and that at the same time has turned a little bit our relationship with the athletes themselves, right? So we used to, like, historically, you would do a deal with a league, and you buy the rights to a league, right? Today, not only you have to have the rights to a league, you might have a deal with the team for local deal for local broadcasting or for local activations, right? So we might have a deal with the MLS, or a company might have a deal with the MLS, yet it's a company that's based in Atlanta. So they're also going to have a relationship with the Atlanta team in order to activate locally. But on the other hand, then they might on top of that have a relationship with Almiron, right? And have him create content. So we have gone past striking a deal with a league, and we're also looking at how we can connect more with the audience by looking at players, right? And whether it's active players or ex-players. And that's why we bring so many ex-World Cup winners to do coverage with us, and that's what we bring so many players to do storytelling with us on their social platforms. That's why we explore with players to narrate alternatively our games on non-traditional media platforms. So that's kind of how we're looking at that.
And for an event like the World Cup, how do you approach it from a unique standpoint to make sure that your broadcast is something that is, new and exciting and interesting for a fan who, as you say there, can, get a lot of information and get close to, athletes and also teams, leagues, themselves through social media?
So it's an interesting perspective, and what I'm going to say might be a little bit controversial, but I think the larger the event, the less you have to do, right? Because HBS produces everything, right? I mean, they can't allow access to 200 broadcasters to a match. They can't allow 200 ENG crews following a specific team. They can't allow Messi to be interviewed by 150 reporters every day. So they try to generate as much as possible of this information. And what you end up is with a massive amount of content that you can today distribute across all these channels. So more than creating the content is how do you ensure that you can distribute it in such a way that you leverage the content that is being produced, right? I think the same happens with the Olympics and NBC, right? I mean, it's just so much information, and Peacock is such a magnificent platform that I think the value of the broadcaster doesn't come in the storytelling necessarily or the creation of the content, and it comes on the distribution of the content. And in NBC, creating an exceptional experience on Peacock to watch the Olympics, on us to be able to serve as much content as possible on VIX for the World Cup. And I think there is an inverse correlation between the relevance of a league and how much of this effort you have to do. The relevance of a competition or a league versus and what you have to do. So if you're extremely relevant, there's very little that you need to do, right? If your relevance is not as big, then you have to do a lot of these things, right? I mean, people will come and watch the Olympics and the World Cup, and we will have some sort of exclusivity, and therefore the people will come and watch it with me, right? For a lesser league, a second tier, or a growing sport, right? I mean, let's take paddle, for example, right? Paddle tennis or pickleball. I mean, those are sports that are growing very rapidly, but they're still tiny, right? So those are the ones that need to make a better effort of telling the story, explaining the game, tutorials, how to make it accessible, where to play it, right? So I think that's the counterbalance that you have there. So for the World Cup, in reality, what we are trying to do is making sure that all this content that is being generated, and on top of that, the content that we generate, is distributed in an appropriate way that makes it to the audience in the easiest possible manner.
Amazing. I wanted to, I guess, run a concept by you. I think it's one I've heard you talk about before, and it's fans without borders. So, there's 6,000 fans crossing from San Diego to Tijuana every week to watch a football match. That's not global fandom in the abstract. It's physical, habitual, deeply rooted. I'd love to explore what your perspective on what global fandom actually is.
So I think fandom, the way I think is fandom is all about belonging, right? And when someone crosses a border, as you say, every week to watch a match, that's not content consumption, that's identity, right? That's community. I think as an industry, we've spent years talking about fandom through ratings and subscriptions, but the strongest form of fandom honestly looks more like culture, right? It's rituals, it's pilgrimage. Fans don't travel because the stream isn't available, right? They travel because being there means something. I think to the extent that these leagues and properties are able to tap into that, it's a little bit of the culture conversation that we had with the demographics, right? things have changed. The evolution of the content distribution have changed, but has changed over time. I think all these leagues still think in encapsulated ways of, I'm going to sell the rights in the US and I'm going to sell the rights in Mexico and I'm going to sell the rights. And I understand thinking globally. It's a much more complicated way of thinking in terms of rights distribution and rights. And I don't think we're there yet. And I think we're far from getting there, especially because of the way these things are. But I do think if I were an owner of a team, right, because fandom goes with a team and goes with if I were the owner of a team, I would try to carve out as much content and as much identity as possible out of all my deals, right? The commercial deals, the broadcasting deals, etc., to be ordered to offer some sort of connection and fandom directly with me to that global fan that, as you say, has been created by this globalization and the ease of travel and the ease of all these things, right? In the end, in a stadium, you'll only be able to accommodate whatever the capacity is, 20 to 60,000. You need to be able to create these ancillary churches where the pilgrimage happens above and beyond, one, whomever is able to pay these absurd ticket prices that some of these events have, and two, beyond the physical space that exists in some of these meccas, right? I mean, you could do the pilgrimage to Mecca and as a Madrid fan and once in a lifetime be able to go to Bernabeu. Even if it's once in a lifetime, you as a team need to be able to account for that and consider that there is that possibility that you should be able to extend to all your fans the capacity of that pilgrimage and that fandom.
Absolutely. And I think that sort of brings us to an interesting question around, where or does at all local fandom end and global fandom begin, or has that distinction really stopped being that useful in, I guess the modern, ecosystem?
Let me frame it this way. I think it's becoming less useful, right? Because the emotion connection will always be local, right? I mean, you could be a Man City fan, regardless of where you live. The connection is with Man City as a team. The reach is global. The connection is still local, right? A Monterrey fan, for example, can support the Cowboys, right? A kid in Tokyo can dream of visiting Dodger Stadium. And a fan in Mexico can follow the Premier League every weekend. I don't think the future is local versus global. I think identities participating in global communities is what's going to drive the economy of all these, of the business and of the connections. So that's kind of how I think about it. The only place where I would challenge myself is the following. Although it is local, right? How can you explain the attachment a kid that has never put a foot in Japan, let alone Tokyo, to be a fan of a Japanese player playing for the Dodgers, right? That's where the emotions and the localization are separated. So if you think of fandom, I would think of two pieces: the rational, which is, I think, geographic, right, and that goes with the local and the global, and the irrational, which is the emotional one, which I don't know if you can explain, right? It could be as easy as your parents giving you your first shirt, or the first game you ever watched, or the only game you had access to when you were listening to the radio. I mean, there's a lot of elements that go into that.
For sure. And I think this time of year is actually one of my favorite times of the year, personally, from a fandom perspective. You have, almost year-long competitions like the Premier League, like the Champions League coming to a close. And you see these incredible celebrations all around the world. I think I saw at the end of the Premier League season, there was like 100,000 people in Kenya on the streets in red shirts celebrating Arsenal's first trophy in 20 years. And it was just incredible. I think that really summarizes what you're saying now.
Yeah.
I guess pivoting to the leagues. So the NFL in Brazil, in Spain, soccer leagues and teams trying to penetrate the United States, India, Saudi Arabia, seemingly they're largely following the money. But you made the point that money does follow fandom. So how do you actually build genuine fandom in a market that does have, limited cultural connection to that sport that you were just talking about there?
All these leagues are businesses, right? So let's start there. And as a business, you have accountability to certain stakeholders. In the case of leagues or federations, those stakeholders are not shareholders, right? So the incentives are different. In one end, you have incentives that are a vote, on the other one are incentives that are just money distribution, right? And others are it's power. I think considering that you always want more and more and more, and the economics keep growing, right? Because you need to pay the players more, and it just trickles down to the end. There is a sense of diminishing returns in some markets, right? I mean, I doubt how much bigger the NFL can get in the US, right? I mean, yes, there is potential within the Hispanic community still, I think above and beyond any other demographic in the US. But beyond that, the next frontier, as a Star Trek fan would say, is beyond the borders of the US, right? The question that I have, and probably illustrates that I don't have the answer to your question, is if you're making $14 billion a year in your core market, and a fraction that doesn't even get to single digit percentages of that internationally, whether the effort spent has diminishing returns. Maybe there's an ego piece to this, right? Where you want to conquer the world. There's a little bit of a conquistador attitude. I don't know if that makes sense or not. I mean, in the end, the sports that conquer the world are the sports that are cheaper to play, right? It's going to be very difficult for golf to be a truly globally assumed sport because you need a lot of things for that to happen. Soccer is a global sport because you don't even need a ball. Like in many of our countries, we started playing with a bunch of socks tied together, right? Or and your makeshift goal was whatever you could find. So there is high correlation between the ease of play and how cheap it is to play with the globalization of a specific sport. So I really don't know. I think economically we're always trying to maximize the value of a property, and I think once it reaches a certain threshold or saturation of your local market, you're always going to try and get money from a different market, and I just think that's the nature of the business.
Yeah, absolutely. From your perspective, do you think there is a meaningful difference between take a league like the NFL and obviously each team having a specific market that they're, obviously looking to commercialize, but obviously they're building, fan relationships in versus a league that simply sells media rights and calls it global reach?
Yeah, I think that's the difference between global reach and global fandom, right? And I do think there is a difference, right? There's nothing wrong as a league to have global reach. I mean, you should. You're extracting the value out of everything, right? Global fandom, though, is do people actually care about your product, right? Is cricket growing in the US, or is it only consumed by Pakistani and Indian and British immigrants, right? Those are two different things. One is as I said, one is distribution. The other one is rational, right? Which is you're there. The other one is emotional, which is irrational. Is there emotional attachment to that product, and how do you build it? I would strive, if I were a league, to look for that emotional attachment, but that is very difficult to do because if there was a formula to do it, everybody would do it, right? There is no formula, and you just have to try and fail and try and fail, and maybe it's bringing an international player into the league, and maybe that flops, right? I mean, bringing Indian players to baseball hasn't necessarily made baseball more popular in India, right? So the selling rights in a market may increase reach. Creating a generation of fans who identify with your league is something entirely different and not as easy to do.
I think accessibility is interesting though, and I'd be interested in your perspective on that. Taking cricket in the US, obviously there is a huge market of expats, myself included, who struggle to build a relationship with the game, in other markets from a time zone perspective, from players who often change teams and you can't keep up. So how do you think accessibility plays into it from from growth of the game perspective?
It's the most important element, I think. There's a dynamic of evolution of the maturity of your product that I think should go hand in hand with the distribution of your product, right? What do I mean by that? Products like the Champions League during their early stages, when selling rights, they're always trying to get money, but they would put more weight in the distribution of their content than the money that they were getting, right? I'm not saying it was the most important element, but it was a very important element, because to the extent that you would grow the league, you could reap the benefits in the future, right? So fast forward to today, and the Champions League can command huge amounts of money for very limited distribution, where they understand now that at this point, the only way they extract the most value is with limited exclusive distribution on paid platforms. Yet, if you're a league that is nascent, or a league that isn't established, or a league that is fighting for your position still, I think you're better off giving away your product for free to platforms that are widely distributed, in lieu of the little money that you will get, that is not a lot, and it might create a very short-term incentive. So I see a lot of these leagues that pursue the money in early stages, and I think that's a flawed short-term strategy.
It's an interesting one. So take YouTube, for example. Obviously, huge distribution platform. You've got a huge amount of, let's call them emerging sports that may be, variations of larger leagues. They might be net new sports. And in some cases, we're seeing, huge traditional sports choosing to broadcast through YouTube. An example of that, down in Brazil. So I suppose, what's your perspective on that from not only an up and coming sport, but then also an established sport from a distribution perspective?
So I think it's a little bit of what we've been discussing. I mean, we like to operate within set forms where there's boundaries, right? Where you have, these are the platforms, these are, and these leagues have long-term deals. So it's also naive to think that on a yearly basis these things will change. But fast forward, and the distribution of a lot of this content hasn't really changed much over the past decades. And I think the platforms have, right? So as you said, you have live mode and Casa TV, for example, in Brazil, leveraging a platform that in essence allows you to spend almost zero in capital expense to set up a TV station, right? Like, think of all these legacy networks, NBCs, the CBSs. I mean, they have so much capital invested in building huge control rooms and production trucks and all these things. We've leaped a generation in terms of technology, and today Olek can launch a channel, which is a linear channel, probably for zero, right? Capital expenditure, right? Or very little. And I don't think the models of distribution have adapted, right? That being said, I shy away from saying that is the perfect model. I think this is the first step into getting a reshape of the distribution business. I think YouTube benefits from having done that capital expense, and today it's basically benefiting from people putting content, sometimes content that they don't have the intellectual property rights for, and YouTube benefits from it, right? I mean, they in today's world they should be able to identify it fairly quickly, and they don't, right? I mean, I think the way a lot of this distribution is done today is not necessarily consumed appropriately by older generations. So I think there's going to be a transition, right? So I think there's not necessarily cannibalization of audiences, because there's a lot of people that might want to watch it on YouTube with an influencer calling a game, versus others might be more purists that want to watch it in a different screen with the traditional narration, right? I think there's space for everyone, but I don't think I think we're going to see the evolution of all those models happen over the next 2 to 3 years.
Talking about evolution, obviously we are in a huge AI shift at the moment.
Yeah.
It's possible to watch, cricket, for example, in any language. Language has historically been one of the biggest invisible barriers to fandom. How much does breaking that barrier change things, do you think?
One thing I have clear, and it's undisputable, broader distribution grows fandom. That's full stop. And the distribution is not only in terms of accessibility, in terms of this feed, right? To be able to reach it. It's also, I would say there's also another two layers. One is language, which AI basically eliminates that hurdle, right? And creates an automatic layer where, and the third one is understanding of the sport, right? Education. So I think leagues need to strive to fulfill the three. It was very easy to fulfill number one. Now it's even easier with YouTube, right? It was fairly complicated to do the language one. Now it's extremely easy and extremely cheap, right? So that's number two. Where they have to put their eyes on and focus is in number three, right? And number three is a mix of one and two. It's distributed free. Previously, you would have to distribute a single feed, right? Today, you can create 5 feeds. You can even create an educational feed, like for amateurs, right, of the sport, and go and understand, and with a lot of graphics and explanations, you can create another one, which is extremely technical for people that already know it and don't want to spend time explaining what is a try and what are cricket sevens and how it has evolved, right? You don't need to alienate today those different types of audiences. You can serve everyone. And I think that's where AI really kicks in.
And do you think that a fan who accesses sport through AI translated or AI enabled, let's call it, content, can they become a real fan in the same way as historically, or do you think something is lost in that?
I don't think we should think of AI as a static element. I think today it's still not there, but it's very close of being there. I tell people this story of the evolution of the platforms. I mean, people used to be fans of actors during the mute cinema days because they were beautiful, right? I mean, people would have painted green lips because they would look red in black and white, right? And when color and audio kicked in, a lot of these people had silly voices, and they fell in love with people that had deep voices, right? And then you have the Morgan Freemans of the world and all that magic of the voice of God, right? I think a lot of people fell in love with some sports by listening to sports on the radio, and then TV came along, and the way of storytelling is different. I mean, you don't need to tell people where the players on the field because you're seeing it. Your storytelling needs to change. I think AI will we're not far from you being able as a fan, if you're an old fan, to asking AI to narrate the game in a specific style that doesn't exist anymore, right? Or for a young fan to ask AI to narrate in a way that it's appealing to them. So I do think that as much as we probably, especially for purists, they might not like it, the reality is it's going to be tailored to the tastes of the people that are consuming, and therefore that will translate in more attachment.
And something you said before just resurfaced with me there in terms of, I guess, secondhand fandom, growing up with your dad's soccer team, and then building your own allegiances through the Champions League or whatever it might be. Is that a generational shift, or has fandom always worked that way? We just call it something else now?
I think the exclusivity of distribution in the past forced us to a certain allegiance. Okay. So putting aside anything inherited from family or community, right? Because your dad took you to the first game and that's how you fell in love, right? I mean, that's a very romantic way of thinking about it, but not everybody falls into fandom like that. And as a matter of fact, in Venezuela, that baseball was the number one sport. Sometimes in the same household, you have conflicting fandoms, right? So I think you stumble upon fandom in different ways. What is true though is that those ways were more limited in the past, and today you have multiple ways of inheriting, of stumbling into fandom. It could be inherited, right, or it could be discovered. I think the mix, if you were to look at a timeline, right, I think fandom was inherited. I would say, I'm going to make up the numbers because empirically I don't know, but I would say 60 years ago, 50 years ago, when the NFL started and all this, 95, because it never was 195% of the fandom is inherited. And as distribution platforms have grown, right? Radio and then TV and then color TV and then live TV, because there was TV, but there wasn't live, and then cable TV, right? Which allows you to watch multiple, and then satellite TV, which allows you to watch it wherever, and then streaming and all that. What that has done is being able to discover it more, right? So I think that mix of inherited versus discovered has changed. And I would venture to say it's going to turn more towards discover than inherited.
That's really interesting. So I guess, from your perspective, in your role and within the business, how do you plan for that in the future? Like, how is this really impacting on the decisions that you guys are making as you're thinking about, the audiences today and the audiences you're going to be encountering over the years to come?
I think you have to have a dual bet, right? You have to cater to the sports and the fans and the audiences that you have today, without and putting bets on long-term plays, right? I mean, on things that might be discovered by people along the way. It's for sure more expensive to get into kind of, let's pick three sports that have become a little bit bigger: paddle, pickle, and lacrosse. You can probably enter those sports from a distribution standpoint at a very cheap ticket vis-a-vis the other sports. So you probably can start doing bets on that and see, like, if the sport grows and more people discover it, then maybe you have a raw diamond in your hand.
Super interesting. And from that perspective, I guess, again, in your shoes, where do local and global fandom strategies actually come into conflict? And how do you resolve that as you're planning?
This is what I think, but you can have multiple perspectives here. I think it will revolve around authenticity, right? I think when something becomes too global, it risks losing what made it special locally, right? But on the flip side, if something stays too local, it limits the growth. You would ask then, what is the solution, right? Again, if I had the formula, like, if it were that easy, right? I mean, if it were that easy to have that perfect balance like the Yankees have, which is extremely local, right? But you can go to any country in the world and somebody's wearing a New York Yankees hat, right? Probably people that have never watched the game, right? Because there is association of that brand with something that goes beyond the sport, that it's global, yet it's so locally rooted, right? Because if you're a Yankees fan, you're not a Mets fan. And I think the solution is in compromise. It's preservation, right? I think you try to scale the experience without diluting the identity that was created in the first place. And I don't think there's a perfect formula for that, but that's, I would think, the vision that you would have to have.
And if fandom without borders becomes, I guess, the defining frame for the next decade of sports and media, what does the industry need to stop doing? And what does it need to start doing to help accommodate that?
And for industry, you mean the sports industry or the media industry?
I mean, both, in terms of, sports generally, but also, the broadcast element to it and I guess the media that wraps around it.
I think that's where some of these things might be at a conflict, right? Because I think as a league or as a team, you need to understand that there's a huge potential that goes beyond the borders of your local geographic constraints. And you need to also acknowledge that there is a huge world beyond your traditional demographic constraints, right? What do I mean about that? The geographic is easy to think about, right? The demographic, it's a little bit more complicated, right? The geographic one, you need to think beyond where you are, right? And acknowledge that to the extent that you can distribute your content more widely, it's easier for people to make connections with your content and your league. Demographic, if you are an owner of a soccer team, it's easier to break through with Hispanics, for whom soccer is probably like religion, than with your typical Midwestern American that is more attached to American football and American football and baseball or whatever it is. The problem is, and I think the easiest example is to think with a very simple exercise, which is, let's call about ticket prices, right? To the extent that you go to the soccer fans as a soccer club, you're going to be able to increase soccer prices. And if you continue digging that demographic, that group of people, you're going to be able to increase and increase and increase and increase. The problem is that you're alienating a large amount of people that probably would want to experience going to a game, but they are not as big fans. They don't understand the sport, and they might not be willing to pay that high ticket price. So how do you combine those two things? How do you make sure that a person that is not a fan of the NFL is able to afford taking his entire family for a Sunday game, right? Because that's the way you grow that group, but it goes at the expense of losing money on this other one. The same example goes with media, right? To which extent do I sell my rights to the highest bidder versus just putting it as broadly as possible? And on my end, to which extent I continue paying as much money for all these leagues and at the same time save some money to bet on these other ones that might be up and coming, right? Again, I think that's, if there was a formula, roles like mine would not exist, right? Because it becomes formulaic, and you just decide how to allocate your resources, and you wouldn't have business development groups or distribution or partnership groups and leagues and teams to be able to reach out, or ticketing and manage ticketing yields, because it's not perfect. I mean, you just need to balance all these elements as fandom changes, and as the plans of you as a team change. Because again, if you're only extracting the majority, if you only want to extract the majority of the economic value, then maybe it's at odds with growing your fan base.
Yeah, which makes complete sense. And I guess just finally, before we do a quick fire round to finish up, where does TelevisaUnivision fit in all of that, what you've just described?
Yeah, as I was answering, as I was actually thinking about that a little bit, right? Because I do think we're uniquely positioned because we've been serving audiences that live between worlds for decades, right? So we have a, let's say, first movers advantage of that. We know that the future of fandom is not monocultural. It's connected, it's multilingual, it's borderless. Uh, and that's exactly where our audience already lives. And it's been there for a while. When you had these second generation Mexican families moving to America, uh, they bring three things with them. I mean, their food, right? Uh, their religion and football. So it's tacos, La Rosa de Guadalupe, and football, right? I mean, that's it. I mean, that's the things you bring with you. And our role then becomes to be the one that understands that, serves them authentically, and helps them connect communities that they build across the borders, right? Um, I think the future isn't fans in one country watching one sport. I think it's fans without borders, as you mentioned, uh, and I want to believe that that's the future we're building for.
Perfect. And it certainly looks like it from the outside looking in. So it looks like you're doing a brilliant job at it. Just before we finish up, I just wanted to throw a few quick fire questions at you. The first one, what is the one thing about global fandom the industry is still fundamentally misunderstands?
I think what they misunderstand is that fandom is not something people stumble upon. I think it needs to be built.
Perfect. And what is the best sporting experience you've ever had as a fan personally, and why?
Ha, that one is an unfair one, because look, I think the Masters tournament at Augusta is probably the one that I would single out, and the why is because I think, talking about fandom, it's the one that takes a lot of boxes because it's kept its nature. So tickets are accessible. It's rights to the tournament are free, right? I mean, they sell the rights, they control the narrative. There is respect for the property. There's respect for the tournament. There is scarcity. There is you can only buy merchandising if you're there. There is a sense of belonging. You go there and kids under 16 are given access to the players more than anybody else. So it builds that fandom. I think, look, it's really one of those things. There's no screens on the place, no phones. You have to live in the moment, right? It's a very romantic way of thinking about it, but it really, and again, you need to be a fan of golf, right? I mean, that's the first start of this. If you're not a fan of golf, you'll never enjoy that. But it truly ticks all the boxes the right way of what you need to do in order to keep a product growing and at the same time monetizing it.
Well, first off, I am very jealous you've been to the Masters. It's certainly on my bucket list.
It's
Thirdly,
incredible.
fandom in 2030 in one word.
I would say diverse.
Perfect. We're definitely going that way. Fourthly, the brand or media company outside of sport doing fandom the best right now.
I'm going to give you two, okay? Adidas and Lego. What Lego did with the Formula One and the Formula One cars in Lego that they did for the drivers' parade in Miami, I don't know if you saw that, is unique. What Lego is doing in going beyond the traditional sets and creating things that are attached to the fandom, setting up stores, getting the product, I think it's magnificent. And I think what Adidas is doing in terms of understanding that there's a sports side that doesn't only live in sports, but it lives in music, like with collaborations with Bad Bunny in terms of releasing shoes and collaborations with Messi and Keith. And they understand it's what I just told you. It's not a single lane, right? It could be a sports shoe that Bad Bunny is doing, right? And it's not disconnected between one and the other.
Definitely. That huge, convergence of, sports, music, culture. It's huge. And then last but not least at all, what's the question that no one ever asks you about bicultural fandom that you wish they would?
Look, I don't know if it's a question. What I think frequently gets misunderstood, and that's maybe the way I would frame it, is the power of the Hispanic community in the US. In isolation, Hispanics in the US represent the 5th largest economy of the world. And I think in general, they are underestimated when it comes to serving them with brands and content. And it usually approached during panels, during analysis, as a niche, not as a mainstream, just second group of demographics that exists, that it's bigger than some of the largest economies of the world.
It's certainly undertapped, I would say, and understood. So that's a great answer. Well, Olek, thank you so much for joining us on the Future of Fandom. All the very best for the upcoming FIFA World Cup, and all the very best.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Future of Fandom. We hope you enjoyed the episode. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and follow LiveLike on LinkedIn for more conversations with the people shaping what's next in the world of sports and media. Until next time, keep building for fans, not just users.